First, I mean, it's a critical point in history that's well worth revisiting. I think one that's faded into the sands of time a bit. But people forget that, 30 years ago, with the collapse of the Soviet Union, Kazakhstan possessed the fourth largest nuclear arsenal in the world. I mean, this was one of the most critical security issues of the 1990s was what to do with the legacy Soviet arsenal, how these states would react to inheriting these arsenals. How do we go about securing these materials? How would you go about employing the scientists and engineers who were involved in this industry? And what the next steps would be. And it was a huge question mark at this point. And fortunately, it had a largely, happy ending. Second, I mean, there were a number of people, here at the lab who did a great deal of solid non-proliferation work in the 1990s to sort of deal with this problem and resolve this problem. So it's something that the lab has a wonderful legacy in doing. Third, I think the book and the talks is a reminder of the complex legacy of nuclear weapons. Kazakhstan's inherited nuclear weapons were an instrument of great power, right? But also great danger, and they came with this very complicated birthright of ecological damage and destruction in Kazakhstan as the Soviets used it as a nuclear testing site. And then fourth and finally, it's an interesting story about people, right? It's a play, as all interesting stories are, with characters on the stage. And in political science or international relations theory, you get sort of bombarded with categorical statements about how states will act at certain points, how states will always do X or Y because that's what's in the state's interest to do. But in my experience, right, in my bureaucratic experience, big things always get done because an interesting assortment of people come together and do all of their own little parts to achieve something big. And in this book, you have this complex tapestry of individuals, Kazakhs, Kazakhstanis, outsiders, activists, scientists, engineers, military officers, all who come together for a common purpose and achieve something big. I think also it's a reminder of a major inflection point for Kazakhstan. What did Kazakhstan want to be in the world? And if you've been following the news over the last few months of the events that have happened in Kazakhstan, you start to see the outlines of another inflection point for the country and where's it going to go and has it maintained the sort of careful balancing act it has for the last 3 decades. And this isn't covered specifically in the books, but my hopes are we might get into this a little bit in the speaker's remarks or in the question and answer portion. So let me say a little bit about the presenter, and then we'll talk about ground rules. So Dr. Kassenova is a Washington, D.C. based senior fellow with the Project on Nuclear Security, Commerce, and Economic Statecraft at the Center for Policy Research at SUNY-Albany. She's also a non-resident fellow at the Nuclear Policy Program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, which is where I've typically seen her in official settings. She's an expert on nuclear politics, WMD nonproliferation, trade control, sanctions implementation, and financial crime prevention. She currently works on issues related to proliferation financing and exploring ways to minimize the access of proliferators in the global financial system. She has a Ph.D. in politics from the University of Leeds in the UK and is a certified anti-money laundering specialist. From 2011-2015, she served on the UN Secretary General's Advisory Board from Disarmament Matters. So the ground rules, for those of you who don't often attend these events, Dr. Kassenova is going to deliver her remarks for maybe 30 to 45 minutes. And at that point, we'll open the floor up for discussion. Please raise your hand electronically as early as the question pops in your head. Likewise, submit your questions in the chat function whenever she's speaking, and that way we can get the discussion rolling very quickly after she concludes her formal remarks and jump right into the discussion so I can get as many of your questions and comments in as possible. So thank you, Dr. Kassenova, so much again for taking the time to be with us today, and over to you for your remarks, and look forward as always to this presentation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mike. I'm really honored and excited to speak to the audience affiliated with the lab today. My book, yes, launched just on Tuesday, so it's all very exciting. I've been working on it for 15 years, so it feels like a big deal to be finally able to see it out in the wild world. Let me start sharing. So I just want to maybe mention from the outset that I've never worked for the Kazakh government, and so my narrative of the story might not be fully aligned with the official narrative, or it might be a little bit more complex and more nuanced. So I just wanted to make sure that the audience is aware that this is not the official representation of events, but rather a scholar trying to make the best use of open sources, interviews, and archival materials in order to write down Kazakhstan's nuclear history. And so the way I want to proceed today, I want to give you political context first and explain why Kazakhstan made a strategic decision to give up not only on Soviet nuclear weapons, to which it didn't have access to command and control of Soviet nuclear weapons, but they were on its territory, and no decisions could be made without Kazakhstan. But I think what's more important is also that Kazakhstan did not see use for nuclear material and critical nuclear infrastructure that remained on its territory, over which it had full control. And after that, I'll proceed to a more practical part of the presentation and share with you how this decision to become nuclear free, how it was implemented, and the role of the United States, its project managers, its technical experts and scientists was extremely important in that process. So first, let's turn to history a little bit. When the Soviet Union collapsed, Kazakhstan inherited more than 1,000 strategic nuclear warheads. There were also more than 100 intercontinental ballistic missiles in Kazakhstan, 40 heavy bombers, several nuclear facilities. I think it's especially important to note that there were facilities that produced and dealt with nuclear material, and there were rather significant stockpiles of nuclear material. There was also one of the world's largest nuclear weapons testing site in the late 1940s. Trying to catch up with the United States, the Soviet government rushed to develop its own nuclear program, and they chose Semipalatinsk region in Kazakhstan as a testing site. The site was built rather quickly, within 2 years, and in 1949, they conducted the first Soviet atomic test. The test continued for 40 years, and especially during the period of atmospheric nuclear tests, the negative impact on the local population and environment was very serious, and the consequences continue now in the fourth generation. So those who were exposed to radiation during the testing period, now their grandchildren and now grandchildren manifest some health issues. Just to, I know that quite a few of you know about Semipalatinsk, and probably some of you traveled there not once. But for those in the audience who are not that familiar with the site, I just want you to imagine the country of Belgium, and that's the size of the testing site. So you can imagine it's a huge territory, and a lot of land was taken up by the military in order to conduct the tests. In terms of infrastructure, there was a part, the experimental field, that was used more for ground and atmospheric tests, and then nearby mountains were used for underground testing. There were boreholes and tunnels in which tests were conducted. In addition to that, there were also some other critical components of military infrastructure. You can see on the photo the anti-missile testing site called Sarishagan, and also the first person to go into space lifted off from Kazakhstan from a space launching pad, Baikonur. And so, Soviet Union collapses and Kazakhstan has all this infrastructure, weapons, bombers, missiles, and material. And it was, as Mike mentioned, a very critical point, I think, of course, for the international security and for the international community, but also for Kazakhstan. And if you talk to former US diplomats and policymakers today, they would remember that story in a very positive way, and they would always say, oh, we were worried about Ukraine, but we were not worried about Kazakhstan and what Kazakhstan would do. But I think it's only, in relative comparison that they recollected in such a way, because actually, as archival documents demonstrate, there was quite serious concern, and nobody knew for at least the first few months in terms of what Kazakhstan government would decide, how it would proceed, and there were worries both about the weapons themselves, but also about nuclear security and whether young government would be able to secure nuclear material and make sure that nothing falls into the wrong hands during the political, economic, and social crisis. But Kazakhstan did take a strategic decision that it didn't want this nuclear inheritance. And I think, if to put it in very maybe simple or short explanation, it was a very fortunate combination of Kazakhstan deciding and making its own calculations that for its own strategic reasons, trying to kind of to get into a nuclear club by force or trying to attach itself to something nuclear wasn't in its interest. But also, on the other hand, the international community was able to give Kazakhstan what it wanted or what it needed in return, or mostly because it just felt insecure, for example, about its security and for many other reasons. And I just want to give you a bit of a background on all these critical components of the decision making process, and how Kazakhstan's interests and the interests of the international community coincided. So, number one concern for Kazakhstan was its security. It felt extremely vulnerable because, it's sandwiched between two nuclear powers, Russia and China, and the rest of Central Asia was quite unstable in the early 90s. I would also remind about the difficult geopolitical situation. Kazakhstan shares a very long border with Russia, and especially in the early 90s, I think it was very difficult for some politicians in Russia to accept that they've lost the Soviet Union, and so some prominent politicians of nationalistic orientation, they would, for example, say northern parts of Kazakhstan belong to Russia, or Kazakhstan is not supposed to be a state of its own. Then you also had China, and China, at that point, there were still unresolved territorial disputes formally between the Soviet Union and China, but now, the Soviet Union fell and it was between Kazakhstan and China, and Chinese population grew at a very high rate while Kazakhstan had all this land. And so, for all these reasons, Kazakhstan didn't feel particularly secure, and it was just very weak on all other fronts at the beginning. And so, number one demand, I would say, or hope or request that Kazakhstan was looking for was security guarantees. In Russian, there is no difference between the words guarantees and assurances. So I in my book, I use guarantees, but for those of you who are um, uh, very into the subject, you'll understand that what in the end what Kazakhstan got was assurances, not guarantees. But I'll refer to it as guarantees. And so on that front, all 5 nuclear states provided such guarantees, and for Kazakhstan, it was especially important that the United States provided them at the high level in several high-level settings and high-level political documents. One of them is, of course, Budapest Memorandum, but there is also a bilateral document between US and Kazakhstan, which is called Charter on Democratic Partnership. Yeah, I think Democratic Partnership. And while assurances that the United States provided were not guarantees, and they were nothing close to what would be provided under NATO Article 5. So it's not that an attack on Kazakhstan is an attack would immediately call for U.S. Response, and the assurances were already nothing went beyond what the US was already obligated under other umbrellas, but it was critical for Kazakhstan that these assurances were reaffirmed, that they were Kazakhstan specific, and that they were put into high level political documents. And so this was really number one thing that Kazakh leadership kept asking and asking during the nuclear negotiations, and that it received to its satisfaction. The second important need for Kazakhstan was access to foreign direct investment in technology. Again, to give you just a bit of context of what was happening in the early 90s, the Soviet Union collapsed and the economies were in shambles. I remember in Almaty, the supermarkets were bare, literally, I don't know. I think it's easier to go through a crisis when you are small and young, but looking back, it was pretty tough, and many factories lost their orders because all the inter-republic ties were severed, and so there was a very serious economic crisis. But at the same time, Kazakhstan was and remains so rich in natural resources, and so they knew that if they get foreign direct investment and technology, they could start exporting oil, for example, and that would jumpstart the economy. And so again, for that reason, Kazakhstan's leadership understood that if they would be trying to prevent denuclearization, that would close the door to all of that. And at the same time, the international community, again, led by the United States, they were able to provide Kazakhstan this access. And US oil giant Chevron was the first company to go into Kazakhstan and develop its largest oil field, Tengiz. Similarly, in terms of access to international institutions, again, for a new republic that never had a say of its own in the international affairs and everything had to be done through Moscow, it was just so important that there would be support from the international community, but again, especially from the United States, for Kazakhstan to become part of the World Bank, IMF, and United Nations, and so on. And again, that support was granted. Equally important, once the decision was made that Kazakhstan didn't want to keep any of the weapons or prevent their removal, the there was a very serious concern, and it is connected to the trauma of Soviet nuclear tests about, how we're going to do it on our own, that there was no technical expertise and there were no financial resources for denuclearization itself. And here again, thanks to the US funded program, initially the non-Luga cooperative threat reduction program, and then all the programs that kind of developed from their own, such expertise and resources were granted, and that made it possible for Kazakhstan to go through the technical process of denuclearization. Domestic environment in Kazakhstan was also conducive for a non-nuclear path because of the legacy of the Soviet nuclear tests, but also because the decision-making process was very centralized, and it was basically the president and a few advisors who were making decisions, and they were the ones who decided, well, not immediately, but pretty early in the process, that what they wanted to do was to move towards denuclearization. So here it's an important difference with Ukraine. Well, in Ukraine, the political environment, the domestic political environment was more complicated, and there were much stronger internal voices for keeping nuclear program. And finally, I think what's important, and what to me as a Kazakh is I find very laudable, is that this new country, with really at the beginning of its statehood, that they cared about international norms, that again, to remind, this was early 1992, and the NPT, whether NPT will continue, will be extended, not extended, extended for a limited time or indefinitely, wasn't decided yet. And it was kind of a fragile moment for the NPT, and it really surprised me, I think, how much Kazakh decision makers and foreign policy advisors cared about that, and how much they didn't want to undermine the main non-proliferation treaty. And so with all of that in mind, with all these conditions and interests playing together, by December of 1993, Kazakhstan's parliament voted yes, and for Kazakhstan to join the NPT as a non-nuclear weapon state. So now, the decision has been made, and now it was time to put it in action. And here I'm moving to a more practical part, of how that was done in Kazakhstan. And I divided this part into four subcategories. I'll first talk a little bit about the removal of nuclear warheads, ICBMs and heavy bombers, and then, the next stage was destruction of missile silos. Then we'll talk about minimizing and securing nuclear material at nuclear facilities. And finally, the most important and most longer term project was securing the former nuclear testing site. So let's start with the removal of nuclear warheads, missiles, and heavy bombers. Throughout the entire period, it was Soviet/Russian military that had full control. Kazakhstan government didn't have access to command and control, and so the weapons themselves and the sites were under control of Russian forces. The complication was that the legal status of Soviet nuclear weapons remaining in Kazakhstan wasn't decided until March of 1994. So, for a long time, there was this limbo in terms of legalese, and practical processes could not be started full force until Kazakhstan and Russia were finally able to write out, the clear status clear legal status of the weapons. And I don't have a chance to go into too much detail here, but for those who will read the book, you'll see why it was critical, the status consideration, because actually in the very early months there were discussions that maybe there should be joint control over weapons that were in Kazakhstan. So in any case, by March 1994, this is when Kazakhstan and Russia finalize it, and they say, okay, all these weapons, they do belong to Russian strategic forces, and Russia will be the one responsible for moving them out. And so 94, 95 is the period when you have uh, warheads and bombers, everything being moved, and missiles being removed from Kazakhstan to Russia. And so the two governments, at one point in the media, it was announced that all weapons are moved, but actually there was not a weapon, but a device remaining at the former Semipalatinsk nuclear testing site. And so, of course, it was a bit of a headache, I think, for everybody involved, especially for Kazakhstan, because Kazakhstan already committed to being a non-nuclear weapon state. It already banned nuclear tests on its territory. It banned it back in 91, right? It joined the NPT 93. So we're now in 94, but we still have this this device that remained at the polygon. Why it happened to be there? The story is that in May of 1991, the Soviet military placed it at the testing site, but it was overtaken by events, because this is the period from 1989 to 91, when the public anti-nuclear movement became extremely strong in Kazakhstan, and Kazakhstan shut down the testing site in August of 1991. So before they could do anything with the device, Kazakhstan banned nuclear tests and shut the testing site. And so, here again, Kazakhstan on its own would not be able to deal with it because it didn't have the expertise, but it obviously also didn't want to have it on its territory. And the United States was also putting pressure on Kazakhstan and inquiring about that device. And, it took a bit of time, but Russian and Kazakh government were able to negotiate, and finally it was destroyed by chemical explosion. I wouldn't be able to give you, very detailed description of the technical process, but it was very important for Kazakhstan that it didn't even appear anywhere close to being a nuclear test. So all the weapons are moved, and now you have to deal with missile silos. And there were two major missile sites in Disarmament and Jangistobe. They were home to Soviet strategic rocket forces decisions. They were not identified on any maps, but there were also another tests, silo launches at two other sites. And so, you have those silos, and of course they were built to be indestructible, and the silo door alone weighed 120 tons and was 6 meters, which is almost 20 feet in diameter. And so Kazakh military had nothing to do with this first stage. It was done completely by Russia, and Russia had to conduct destruction to the extent that was required by START, right? And so So what they did, they removed the missiles, removed the equipment and supplies, and blasted the top part of the silos to the required 6-meter depth crater. But those 120-ton doors and all the debris were left, and so the picture you would see would be a semi-destroyed silo site, which would meet STAT requirements, but obviously wasn't enough. And this is where the cooperative threat reduction program helped. Kazakhstan, together with the United States, completed the second stage of silo elimination, and they've done it at all locations. Okay, moving to the third component that is connected to securing nuclear material. I will use one of the most important stories and the one that is, I guess, most cinematic, and that's the project Sapphire. Here, the story begins at the facility called Ulba Metallurgy Plant in Uсть-Kamenogorsk. So Uсть-Kamenogorsk was also a closed town during the Soviet period because of the facilities like Ulba. And in the early 90s, as any other nuclear facility or just any other facility in Kazakhstan, it went into a very serious crisis. It had several lines of production. It wasn't only about fuel pellets. They were also working with other materials such as beryllium and tantalum. I don't know if I'm pronouncing it correctly. But basically, almost all orders stopped, and it was only the uranium line that was still working. Salaries were delayed by months, and so on. But at the same time, there was valuable and dangerous material stored at one of the warehouses at the facility, and that was almost 600 kilograms of highly enriched uranium. Why it ended up there? At some point during the Soviet period, the Soviet Union experimented on some secret Project Alpha submarine-related program, and so that HEU was in relation to that program, and it just remained there. And it sounds as though the decision to reach out to Americans about highly enriched uranium was done at the top. It not it sounds like it was done at the top, but initially the reaching out happened in a very informal way. So basically, the director of the facility reached out to one of the employees of the U.S. Embassy in Almaty. Probably many of you know him, Andy Weber, and it's funny. They actually their first meeting, on the same day. First, he reached out to Andy, and then I think in the evening of the same day, they met. 3 of them, the director of the facility, Andy Weber, and the U.S. ambassador to Kazakhstan, Bill Courtney, and that meeting took place in an office of a hunting equipment company, and so for a few months there was this kind of semi-informal, not very official communication going on, and then finally at some point it becomes it goes up many levels, and finally the facility director discloses that the material in question is actually 90% enriched, right? And he also provides the amount that it's 600 kilograms, and so it was obviously very concerning for the U.S., but also the US never dealt with something of that magnitude of removing so much of material from another country. There was some interagency issues. DOE, for example, worried that there will be opposition within the US by the environmental groups. Pentagon, on the contrary, wanted to get the material so that it doesn't go back to Russia. And so you had all these different opinions, views, but also in terms of practicalities, where to find money and find this money quickly for the operation itself, but also for compensation. And Mike mentioned about how it's people who make things work, and literally for these two, for every story in my book, there would be some people who, who would be credited that, oh, it's that person who knew how to make it work in terms of getting all this funding from already appropriated funding streams and so on. But the operation itself, it went, I think, I cannot say smoothly. In the end, it was successful, but it was a team with lab people, but also some from DoD, and it was done all in the context of high secrecy. There was an agreement that nobody should know about it. The final stretch was very stressful because it was early fall, or no, late fall in Kazakhstan, and for example, when they already did all the work and put everything in casks and were ready to move material in casks, put on trucks to the airport so that US planes can get it back to Oak Ridge, the weather conditions became so difficult. There was black ice, and so both Kazakh but also American people in charge of security and safety, they were very worried that a truck will fall into a nearby river and so on. And here also, while the US government kept very tight lid on the story, before material reached Oak Ridge, somehow the information leaked to at least one of the journalists, and who wanted to run a story, and the White House basically pleaded and said, please hold on, hold off for 24 hours. We just want to make sure that the material is inside Oak Ridge when the information becomes public. There were also other important projects done at various facilities in Kazakhstan on material protection, control, and accounting. And they would start with something as basic as putting fences around facilities, and then, with more and more sophisticated and advanced security systems, and helping with computerizing the records, alarm systems, and all of that. Now the final component is, before the final component. So, while we're still on nuclear material, another good story is about spent fuel removed from a facility that hosted a fast breeder reactor. And again, lots of just kind of interesting, fun stories about how, I'll just give you one episode. You see the cranes, they had to buy them in China, and they had to buy two of them to put one at the facility and the other one on the receiving side. They were moving fuel to the from a testing site to a reactor facility on the former at the former testing site. And so they procured the cranes, but it would take forever to put them together. And in one of the conversations of American project managers and Kazakh project managers, somebody joked saying, "Oh, I wish we had 100 Chinese workers, who built the crane to put it to put them together." And then they were like, "Well, actually, it's a good idea," and they were able to bring, those from China who knew the equipment, and that helped to put them together in a quick manner. So yeah, that material was moved and is now stored for 50 years. There were also research reactors in Kazakhstan, which were converted to low-enriched uranium fuel from highly enriched uranium fuel, and any material that was in excess of the needs, everything was moved or downblended, moved to Russia or downblended. Okay, so now the final component and the most interesting and most labor intensive, it was the work done at the former nuclear testing site at Semipalatinsk. So you had all these tunnels and boreholes. Some boreholes were used, some were unused. And for Kazakhstan, the challenge was that it didn't even understand, it didn't have full information on what was remaining at the site. But it definitely wanted first to make sure that there is no material that could be stolen and then misused. And also, so there was a security concern, but there was also a safety concern because the former testing site, because it's so huge, you cannot really prevent people and animals from coming in. And they were worried that just for safety reasons, it worried them that they didn't understand what danger it represented. And initially Kazakhstan worked on parallel tracks with Russia separately and with the United States separately. But at one point, and here a very big role belongs to Zig Hacker, who was able to bring scientists from three countries, from Russia, Kazakhstan, and the US, together, and then it moved into trilateral cooperation, which was much more efficient. Just to give some examples, you see Kolba container, for example, or the yellow thing, and these are containers in which some experiments with nuclear material and explosives were done, and a few of them remained. And so work had to be done on securing those, which was a difficult technological endeavor. Also with tunnels, initial sealing of the tunnels with the help of the US wasn't sufficient. As one US expert described to me, that it was done on the chip, basically in a rush, just to seal them. A few years after they were sealed, almost 70% of them were tampered with, and obviously it was a serious security risk, and so everything had to be redone and redone properly. Here, I want to underscore the role of scientists and technical experts. Very often, it would be exactly the scientists and the technical experts that would be pushing their own governments and their own bureaucracies for more cooperation, for disclosing more information. For example, with the Russian side, it was definitely the scientists and those who previously worked on the testing program who knew and understood very well what the risks were and how much still remained. Very often, they would be the ones lobbying their own government to disclose more information, and the information was disclosed gradually, not everything at once. And sensitivities, they went, in various ways. Um, Obviously, there were sensitivities between the U.S. and Russia as two countries for which nuclear weapons are still at the heart of the national security, but also, in terms of U.S. and Russia being nuclear weapon states, right, and Kazakhstan being a non-nuclear weapon state, so some information had to be not disclosed to Kazakhstan because of the NPT provisions, and so, three parties had to manage very difficult political and technical challenges. And with each project, in terms of technical challenges, something would come up. They would open a tunnel, and then they would see that, you know, because of the underground nuclear test, there were all these cracks in the mountain, which now got water, and water froze, and um, at some points they had to use manual labor to get through some tunnels, and so just with every single project there was something that was difficult. But it's really amazing and really wonderful to read and to hear stories about how um, solutions were found, and they could move on. um, so while officially in 2012, I think, um, three presidents, Russian, Kazakh, and President Obama announced at one of the nuclear security summits that, they announced that for 17 years we worked at the polygon and we've secured so much, and the world has become safer. But I think everybody who knows the site, who worked on it, everybody agrees that obviously the main part of the job was done, but the former testing site is not something that you can ever leave unattended in the foreseeable future. So I think I'll stop here. For more details, you can read my book and follow the stories, which just came out. Thank you, and I'll be happy to take questions now.
Wonderful. Thank you, Dr. Casanova. So
You
Kate
stop
Thomas is
sharing.
going to put
Mhm.
the link to the book up in the chat function, so people can go to the Stanford University Press website and see the book for themselves.